So I'm so pleased to have Randy Mitchell. Randy is a professor at the University of Akron who's worked with bumblebees, and I think he's going to talk a little bit about some of his research for many years, and then was a recipient of a grant along with Karen Goodell to put a bee team together and survey the state in looking for the Rusty-Patched Bumble Bee. So Randy, so happy to have you with us, and I'll turn the screen over to you.
Thanks so much, Denise. You're one of the treasures of our extension system here in Ohio, and it's really great to be working with you too. Hi to everyone out there. I'm going to try to give you a bird's eye view of some of the things that I've been doing with a number of really wonderful collaborators that are listed on the screen there. And it's all focused on this bee up in the upper left corner. So what I'm going to try to do is give you sort of a teaser. Then I'll talk a little bit about bumblebees in general, and then more about the survey that Karen and our students and collaborators have been doing here in Ohio to find where this really interesting bee goes. I first came to Ohio in 1995 to join the faculty at the University of Akron, and when I started working there, I was really happy to see that one of the real giants of pollination ecology was working here. Walt Macior, you can see his picture in the corner there. If anyone who's been around Ohio for some time involved with any of the plants or pollinators or anything like that would know about Walt. He's really been a fixture. And when I got here, I wanted to learn about the bumblebees around here. I knew the western species, but I didn't know what was going on here in the east. And he gave me some really great help and advice. And one of the key things was he said, there's 5 species you're going to see most of the time. There's some oddballs that you'll see once in a while, but these are the 5 you're going to see. And you can, we'll see both common and scientific names as we go. But the key one to pay attention to is at the bottom of the line here. The Rusty-Patched Bumble Bee, and there's a picture of it up here in the right. You can see it has a nice rusty patch. It is not a hard bee to identify, at least for the workers. He said, you're going to see these 5. And he was right. You'd see them in your backyard. We would see them I did surveys in the oak openings and in the Cuyahoga Valley. We saw this bee. It was really common. And unfortunately, if you go out into the same places, you will not see the same bees. You would not see the rusty-patched bee at all. Up through recently, people had sort of casually started noticing around 2000, you just couldn't find that bee. And it's not the only bee that's going down. The golden northern bee, which is really easy to identify, it also seems to be fewer in number, although it's still around. It doesn't seem to be as common as it once was. And although Walt's not around to work with us on this anymore, it puzzled me and a lot of other people. And so the whole motivation for the Ohio Bee Survey starts off with this really, sorry, I wanted to show you these data. I'm not just making it up. The numbers of bees from the Fish and Wildlife Service, they pulled a lot of information from museum specimens, just plummets right around that time I'm talking about. And that's the motivation for the work that Karen and our associates and I have been doing. So what I'm going to do now is back up a little bit and try to make sure everyone's on the same page. If you're logged in here, I'm probably going to be repeating a lot of things, but I think it's useful to think about. That first off, honeybees are wonderful creatures, but they are domesticated animals, and they're only one type of domesticated animal. We've got a lot of wild critters that do many of the same things that honeybees do. And in Ohio, we've got maybe 400 species, in all of North America, 10 times that. There's an enormous number of different kinds of bees. They're different sizes, they're different shapes, they're different abilities, and they are as diverse as any of the groups that most naturalists would be interested in. They're way more diverse than birds and mammals put together for any comparable area. And trying to think only about just bees is kind of like trying to talk about only mammals. It's a very broad category, and there's a lot of variation within that category. And so as we think about what seems to be some very widespread declines in honeybees, but also in other bees, This is not just the honeybee situation is pretty specific and might have very specific causes. But when we talk about all the bees going down, which there's evidence is occurring, we're going to have to think about a lot of different kinds of critters. But that's too much for us all to handle. So what I want to focus in on is one particular group, and it's my favorite insects, basically. They are many other people's favorite insects. These bumblebees are very visible. They're fuzzy. They look like they have little personalities. They're in fact so much so that they make appearances in Beatrix Potter stories with Mrs. Tittlemouse, who wanted to. Some bumblebees wanted to share her nest, and she got very upset about that. And that's actually, as with most of Beatrix Potter's work, really well founded in the biology. That's a common occurrence for bumblebees to try to nest in old mouse nests. Bumblebees will visit almost any flower you're interested in, which is of a great value for making them as pollinators. They're around the whole season, and so they're likely to be important. And so aside from all that, I just have really liked them enough that I glue numbers on the back of them and follow them around sometimes, and have been trying to study them more and more as time's gone on. So I want to give you a little bit of a background on why bumblebees have some of the interesting specifics about that, and which is some of the reasons that I want to study them. Let's talk about economics first, because this is the backup system. Honeybees are great. You can cart them around. You can have a lot of them where you need them and then move them somewhere else. You can gather honey from them, but they are only one species, and if you rely on only one thing and there's a problem with that thing, there's going to be some problems. It turns out that bumblebees are great backup pollinators in that sense. They're hard to raise commercially. You can do it, and they're important to raise commercially, but bumblebees, and in fact all wild bees put together, make a really important and large contribution to our economy, to our gardens, and to our wild areas. And so they are providing a lot of economic value aside from the aesthetic and wildlife value that many of us would be interested in. So if you're sort of looking for a more pocketbook-oriented reason to care about bumblebees, they're doing a lot of work for us. That's why we can have watermelons and squashes and quite a number, and tomatoes in particular. They're quite necessary for pollination of a lot of different things. They also have some abilities as pollinators that are not shared with very many other bees. Remember, these bees vary a whole lot, and you can see in the video there, I hope you're seeing it, that there's a Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee. She's finding her way into this bottled gentian. You can see that that's a really tough flower to get into. It's got these pleated corners. You got to be big and strong to get in there, and a honeybee just can't do it. And most bees can't do it, but a bumblebee can. They're big, they're strong, and they're pretty smart too. They're well known for being able to handle fairly complicated flowers. And so there's a lot of plants that can only be pollinated by a robust bee, such as a bumblebee. Compared to bumblebees, even on less specialized flowers, they tend to be faster. They tend to move more pollen around and provide more service. And that's an important addition. It's as with so many things, having only one type of bee as your pollinator leaves you vulnerable in the same way that having an investment portfolio that was all Microsoft stock would leave you a little vulnerable to whatever might happen to that particular group. Instead, you want a portfolio of pollinators, and bumblebees are a great addition to the portfolio, in part because even just by having bumblebees present, you have diversity. If you look at that picture at the bottom, these two bees down here are sisters. They have the same mother. They were raised in the same nest at the same time, but you can see that they can vary amazingly in their size, and that means that the types of flowers they can visit will vary quite a lot. And so the little bee can go to little flowers and make a good living at it, and the big bee, although it takes a lot of energy for her to move around, so it's costly, she can get access to food that would not otherwise be available, like the bottled gentian. And that also means that there's energy available, that they are pollinating plants that otherwise wouldn't get pollinated. That's in contrast, if you look in this little middle diagram here, honeybees are all the same size. They're sort of a factory commodity, and if you make one honeybee, you're making the same honeybee. In the bee world, we talk about tongue length, because that determines what size of flower you can visit. And honeybees all have the same size of their bodies and also the same size of their tongues. But if you look just based on these two girls you can see at the bottom, you can have workers that have tongues that give them basically the same working size as a honeybee, all the way up to bees that are 2 times that size. And that's let alone when you bring in queens, who can be substantially larger than that. So this gives them a sort of a wide array of sizes of plants that they can visit and that they can pollinate. So that's another element of what they give. They also have some really remarkable abilities to do things that again, honeybees and many other bees can't do, and that's to do this buzz pollination. I'm stealing I'm trying to give credit where I steal things, and this here is a great set of videos that show that when these bees visit certain flowers, in this case flowers that are in the potato family, they can engage their wing muscles but prevent them from moving the wings, and that causes their thorax to vibrate at a pretty good pitch. And if they can modulate that pitch to middle C, they start to vibrate the anthers so that these anthers, which are kind of like a long straw with sand in it, can release pollen that would otherwise be locked up inside there. And so you can see it's squirting all over her. She's going to get the pollen and take it home to her babies. But the plant, it's also going to get on her, and then as she goes from flower to flower, she's going to be pollinating these tomatoes and related plants that couldn't otherwise be pollinated. Oops. And so the outcome of this is that there's a lot of plants that can only be pollinated by bumblebees because they're able to do this buzz pollination. That's very important to the tomato industry because if to a first approximation, they require this buzz pollination. If you're growing them in a greenhouse, you're not going to have wild bumblebees available. And if you bring in honeybees, they can't do the job. So it used to be they'd take electric toothbrushes that they could get a little vibration in there, or tuning forks, and you could move the pollen around a little bit. It was very ineffective because people had to do all the work. And if you could have hundreds of bumblebees running around. So now people have found a way to raise captive bumblebees and allow them to work in greenhouses, and we have greenhouse tomatoes in the winter because of our little helpers. Another element that bumblebees can do is that they can warm their temperatures up. Undoubtedly, you've learned in the past that insects in general are cold-blooded. They are ectotherms, requiring external sources of energy. Well, they kind of cheat because those big wing muscles of theirs and their large size in the fur allow them to actually generate and maintain warm temperatures in their body. So up in the upper right you can see a thermograph where the color corresponds to the temperature of the bee. And it's white hot, which corresponds to around 95 degrees Fahrenheit in that thorax. And so she can go out in the middle of early spring when temperatures might be down around 35, 40, and still move around, whereas honeybees really aren't going to be active until the temperature's over 65 or 70, and certainly not doing a lot of pollination that way. So bumblebees are especially useful during inclement weather periods at high altitudes and situations like that. Now, this costs them a lot of energy, but if the alternative is not to be able to gather any energy, the balance works out well. This also helps the bees in their nests. So the lower left picture here is showing a artificial bumblebee nest. It's basically a cardboard, a plywood box about 8 or so inches on a side with some cotton batting in there for them to insulate the nest. And you can see there's a number of bees here. It's a social situation with the queen and her daughters who help her. And inside, and we'll show you pictures in more detail in a minute, all these little wax cups, sort of like a thimble, that they can lay eggs in and provide food for them. But just as with any creature, you'll develop better and faster if the temperature's high. And so the queen bumblebee will actually warm up and keep the central area of the nest warm. And you can see in this second thermograph now, each of those bees you can see on the left. This is just amazing pictures a friend provided. You can see that the workers are warm. The larger bees, this is probably the queen, is even warmer, and there's workers in the middle who are keeping the brood really warm, and that will allow them to develop a lot faster in those challenging spring conditions of a newly founded bumblebee nest. So I'll tell you more about the nesting in just a moment, but the key thing here is that because of their remarkable thermal abilities, these bees can give us pollination when we wouldn't otherwise be able to get it. I think it's useful to have an idea of the life cycle of these critters so that we can put it all in context, because it's not like honeybees. Honeybees are amazing animals, but they really weird is the quick way of saying it, but they're distinctive. They have a lot of characteristics that almost no other insects or animals have, including having tens of thousands of bees in a hive, having a multi-year life cycle. There's a lot of things that are quite weird. And bumblebees have some of those attributes. Their colonies, however, are not multi-year. It is an annual cycle. It's like with wasps and many other social insects. And so you can see this is a one-year circuit here on the right, and I'm going to take you through that. It starts off right now, actually just a few weeks ago, we were getting level D on the right here, mating. So an existing colony will produce brand new young queens and drones, and they'll mate. And then the queen, right now, this is happening as we speak. There are queens, it's getting cold. They are finding places where they can burrow in just under some compost or leaves or some sort of a crevice that they can get a little protection from that. And so they will overwinter down underground, as in the corners there. You can see the kind of habitat at the bottom that this is happening in. They'll be hidden away there, able to withstand the cold temperatures of winter, but not because they're hidden, not quite as extreme as would be if they were out in the open, until spring. When the temperatures and the photo period gets right, these queens will emerge, and they'll start gathering food from flowers. But only to feed themselves. Because what they need to do is find a nest. They need to find some place that they can set up something like I showed you in the previous picture. Some sort of a secluded cavity that there might even be a little bit of some sort of insulation in there. And so a great spot for that is an old mouse nest, just like Beatrix Potter was talking to us. Inside an old mouse nest, or maybe a pile of leaves, or in the crevices of rocks in the foundation of a house, or just some rocks in general, some sort of a cavity that she can, has a good entrance and exit that can be controlled, and some insulation. And she'll go in there, and having discovered a good spot, go in there, establish that, and then begin visiting our daffodils and crab apples and all the spring beauties, all those early spring flowers, gathering both nectar and pollen, because she needs the nectar for energy, she needs the pollen for the protein that's required to both sustain her, but much more importantly, to provide to the offspring, because she's going to build little tiny wax pots, like up in section B here. She'll make some pots. Some of them she'll spit out the nectar she gathers and dry it out and make a type of honey. Not enough that you and I could harvest it. It's really impractical to harvest bumblebee honey. But it's available for her to feed her offspring, and then she'll make some balls of pollen, and she'll lay some eggs. And so for the first few weeks of the year, from say late March until about May, it's just her feeding her babies. And so you'll only see queen bumblebees early in the year. Not only they are the only type of bumblebee you'll see, but it's you will only see a few of them because there's not very many. And so she's going to be going in and out of her little nest that she's formed under there, provisioning her offspring. I often liken this to a pioneer situation. If you remember the Little House on the Prairie, where Ma and Pa and Laura and the girls would be out there in the middle of nowhere, nobody within 10 miles of them, and they had to take care of everything all by themselves. They had to get their food, they had to make their shelter, they had to take care of themselves, defend themselves. they were all alone. Well, this is like that, except that Pa's not there. He died last fall, and the girls haven't been born yet to help. It's just Ma, all by herself. And so this is an extremely dangerous period for the bumblebees, and they can often have if there's a cold period where they can't get out, they'll often have a nest failure. So this is a really difficult and critical time. They do a lot of amazing things to manage it, but it's very tricky. If she's successful, sometime in probably May, the first few, she'll probably have a dozen babies that she manages to raise, and they'll be tiny, itty-bitty, because she's the only one providing food for them. But then they could go out, and she doesn't have to go out much or at all, and she can stay and take care of things in the nest, defend the nest against any potential marauders, and then those offspring bring food and can raise their sisters. And now there's the potential for sort of exponential growth, because the more babies she has, the more babies she can provision, and they'll start to make more and more larvae. She'll be laying eggs. Her workers will be working with her and get an ability so that by the end of the summer, there might be as many as 100 workers in the nest. Now that's way less than a honeybee nest, but it's plenty big for a bumblebee. That's the way they do it. The size of a colony is seldom over a couple of hundred, and often it's only a few dozen, even late in the summer. But I just love this picture from Alex Wild. They just can really get rolling because of that potential for exponential and geometric growth that can happen there. By the end of the season, it can be humming. 100 bumblebees is nothing to sneeze at. They're big and very impressive animals. So now let's continue and finish off the year's pattern. So at this point, they're all about gathering food and making more babies to build up that colony so that they have enough energy to do the reproductive phase of the colony. Remember, really what matters here is not the workers as much as what the workers are helping to manufacture, which is they're trying to make a situation where their sisters can become reproductive. And so at the end of the year, the developmental switches are thrown, and now the same types of eggs that would have become workers just are provisioned differently, just as with honeybees, and that allows them to get big and for their reproductive organs to develop, and they also start to make some males. Up till now, no males have been made. They come from unfertilized eggs, just as with honeybees. And so then you get the drones and the queens made, and the great circle of life has been completed for 1 year. At this time of year, last year's queens, the ones who came out in this past spring, are dying. Their nest is no longer going to be used. It will not be used another year, and all that's going to be the males will die after they mate. Although if you go out your sedum or something, you see a whole bunch of bumblebees on a warm day in October. They're almost certainly all males who just don't have much left to do. The females of the queens have already gone into hibernation for the winter, and so this is the pattern of life for these bumblebees, and for that matter for wasps and most of the social Hymenoptera, except for honeybees. It's a 1-year life cycle, and you start from scratch every single spring. So that's sort of a little of the background biology. There's so much neat stuff about the biology. Come talk to me sometime. We'll discuss some of that. What I want to do is quickly introduce you to the 5 species that you are likely to see in Ohio nowadays. By far the most common is going to be the Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee. It only has a little bit of yellow on its abdomen. In fact, look at all these bees. If you look at their abdomens, they have a different amount or pattern of yellow and other colors, and that's how you tell them apart. So this one only has 1 stripe. There's a number of mimics that may show up that look a lot like that, but if you look closely, you can figure them out. Probably the next most common would be the 2-spot and the Griseoculus, the brown-belted bumblebee for Griseoculus and the 2-spotted for Bimaculatus. Those are the other 2 you're going to see a lot of. If you're lucky, you'll see Bombus fervidus. One of them that I mentioned is declining. It's still reasonably common. We can see it, especially in my experience in wetlands and in wild areas. It doesn't like town as much as the other three. And if you're real lucky, you might see Bombus vagans. It used to be much more common, but it's less common nowadays as well. I'll show you a date on that in a minute. But what I'm not showing you is one of the 5 that, vagans was not mentioned by Macior to me as being common. Instead, affinis was, or affinis. We've never decided how to properly pronounce that. You can see it's a really distinctive bee. A worker of this is going to be pretty easy to tell. It has a rusty patch, which is good for the Rusty-Patched Bumble Bee, that's surrounded by yellow. Behind it, you can see the brown-belted bumblebee has a sort of a brownish color, but there's no yellow surrounding it on there. Now, this isn't going to tell you're not going to be an expert at identifying bumblebees from this, but I just want to give you an idea that there are different bumblebees, and they're all different in not just their coloration but their behavior. Some of them are early bees that are mostly abundant, like Bimaculatus is going to be almost done by July, whereas Impatiens is still busy. Others are going to come out later. There's some that I'm not showing you here that tend to show up a little later in the year. There's a lot of variety in what they can do. Some of them have short tongues, some of them have long tongues, and that changes the types of flowers that they have access to. So these are now there's another dozen or so species you might run into, but you're not going to run into them very often. And so we'll leave it at this for now. We'll talk about the common stuff. So if you go out and look at bumblebees as much as I do, you start to see some patterns. This is for a particular site I go to most years, showing that for each of these species, so look at the one that's outlined in red, Bombus fervidus here. That's a really easy bee to identify. It's all yellow. And if we look at it in 2000 and 2002, it was the majority of the times I saw bees visiting my favorite plant, Mimulus ringens. So we'd go out there, and I'd just see tons of Bombus fervidus there. I'd see a few of impatiens, and even see a few Grizzioculus. But by 2006, where'd it go? Fervidus is gone. It showed up again in 2014, but what we saw was a very dramatic and speedy reduction in abundance of one of what was once our common bees. And this is one, in fact, well, yeah, I mentioned before, this is one of those that seems to be having some troubles. No one's quite sure why. But this is the kind of data that started people to wonder what's going on. When I saw when I couldn't find one of the bees Macior said should be so common, it got me wondering. And then I saw this pattern for fervidus, which didn't have to be common at these sites back in 2000, but was a similar situation. So this got me to thinking, and a lot of other people thinking, because similar things showed up for other. Excuse me. Similar things showed up for these other bees, and we just started looking around and discovered that this was not just something happening in Ohio. That although sort of in a repeat of things you've seen and heard before, although the dark area here is where you were likely to find the Rusty-Patched Bumble Bee back before 2000. This light shaded area here where the red symbols are is where it was found between 2002 and 2012. Now there were other sightings. For example, the 2 sightings here in Ohio didn't make it into the Goulson article, but we have seen it in that period in 2 places, in Columbus around 2010 and at the Toledo Zoo in the children's garden. I mean, this is not a bee that needs to be in a wild area. There was a sighting there by Mitch Magditch of a worker Bombus affinis, and that's the last it's been seen in Ohio, period. It is, this bee is still, I found it a year and a half ago, and many other people are still finding it really abundantly in Wisconsin, and there's a lot of reports in Illinois, not so many in Indiana anymore, and Minnesota is showing a lot more than was shown as far as 2012 goes, but it's gone. And there's a couple of sightings over on the East Coast, but they're real scattered. It looks like it's its range has contracted to just this little section around Lake Michigan. And we fear that this bee is going down. We don't know why it's going down. I'll show you what little we know about that. But it's just declined to a remarkable degree and very abruptly. Which brings up the bee survey. Here's a smattering of the people who've worked with us on this, our student and volunteers, and some of you will recognize either yourselves or people you know in this picture. The way we're able to do this bumblebee survey is because of the foresight of the Department of Transportation. The Department of Transportation, let me back up. After 2000, I started talking to everybody I knew, and I think Karen Goodell on the far right of this photo also was doing. We were talking to people and saying, "Have you seen the bee?" And I haven't seen the bee. Have you? And we started poking around, and nobody was doing it. So we'd been informally trying to organize anyone who could identify bees to keep an eye out. And by 2012, 13, we were really worried. At the same time, the Fish and Wildlife Service received a petition from a insect conservation group called the Xerces Society saying, this bee is going down, can we please put it on the endangered species list? And that happened. Only a couple of years ago, it was placed onto the endangered species list. And that means that anytime any activities might cause problems for that animal, special precautions need to be taken. Now, the Department of Transportation gets involved because they do a lot of things that might disturb habitat. And before it was listed, they saw that this bee might be listed, and they didn't want to get caught flat-footed, as far as I can tell. And they said, we need to know where it's is it around, and if it's around, what are the kind of habitats it's found in, so we can watch out for it, check ahead of time whether it's there or not, and make sure we're not going to be damaging this endangered species. It'll also save that a lot of time and money, which would be good. So they put out a grant request that, well, what it technically said was we need to do a statewide survey for bumblebees. But what I thought it said was, would you like to have the best summer vacation ever? Because this is what I do for fun, is just go out and try to find bees. And the whole purpose of this is to go out as many places as we can and see if we can find the Rusty-Patched Bumble Bee. There is another bee that was on the list for us to look, one that barely showed up in Ohio at all, called the yellow-banded bumblebee. It showed up sort of in the Youngstown area occasionally, but much more commonly in Pennsylvania. We were looking for it too, but we're going to stick with the Rusty-Patch for today because I've never seen that bee myself. Karen has. So Karen and I got this together. We were independently putting together proposals for this, and when I discovered that she was doing it, I knew she was the best bumblebee biologist in the state. I asked if I could work with her because I wanted to be involved with this thing, but working with her would make the project 10 times better, and so we decided to join forces, which also helps because of the geographic spread. We've got to cover the whole state. We can't just look outside in one place and say, nope, not here. You've got to do a pretty thorough survey. We set up 3 goals here. One of them is this survey. We just got to go all over the state and try to find these bees. We also want to figure out what kind of habitats are good for that particular bee, but recognizing that we're not going to see a whole lot of the rusty patch, if any at all. We also were trying to do groundwork so that if more bees are going down, for example, Bombus fervidus, we have some baseline information about where it is found and what kind of habitats are good for it, or just for bumblebees in general. We also thought that this would be a great opportunity to recruit citizens to contribute to this search, because this is going to require a lot of geographic coverage, and the more eyes and feet, the better. The system we set up, along with our postdoc Jesse Lanterman and my grad student Paige Rear, is to use some of the guidelines given by the Fish and Wildlife Service for how to do this, and apply it pretty rigorously. We had to adjust it for the situations where we were. We were not allowed to kill bumblebees for this, for obvious reasons. So we had to train our students all to identify all the bumblebees by sight, or to take pictures of them so that that had all the information necessary for us to identify them. And this worked really well. The students learned so fast. was great. And we just had to find a big patch of flowers, an acre, which is a football field. So you can't go to just a little site and do an hour and a half worth of walking around to find bees. You'd be seeing the same bees multiple times. So you got to spread out, get an hour and a half worth of walking and looking. And in that time, there's a lot of we'd figured out that if a bee species is there, you're going to see it, and it means you're going to see 100, 200 bees over that time period. We went to a lot of places, and close to all over the state, and we targeted areas that where the bees had been found in the past. So up in the Toledo area and in Columbus, and we had some suspicions there was interesting stuff going on in up here. These also, of course, happened to correspond mostly to where we were based. But we tried to get throughout the state. It was hard to find really good areas to survey in some portions of the area, either because there weren't a lot of public lands or because the land was all agricultural with plants that aren't visited by bees. And the only way you're going to find these bees is if they're visiting flowers. So we did a couple hundred sites. We got to almost all the counties. We saw, over the course of 2 years, 25,000 bumblebees. Out of that, we saw 11 species. So we saw several that I haven't told you about. We even found a couple of bees that aren't supposed to be in Ohio or are supposed to be just barely in Ohio or very rare. We're still trying to confirm those, but we're pretty sure that we found, if there was something out there, we were going to find it. Public parks were easiest for us to find and get access to, but we had some remarkably strong help because of Denise's outreach to people like you, where people said, I've made a prairie of my own. Would you like to come and survey it? And we did as many of those as we could, trying to even our coverage out. So we really prioritized places if they were further away from where we already had a lot of observations. And because we were working with Department of Transportation, we tried to include roadsides. And there's a lot of good habitat on roadsides that we wanted to evaluate and see, well, where are these bees showing up? Are we going to find any rusty patch? We found, this is to give you an idea, we also recorded other bees. I mean, there's a zillion other kinds of bees. We were targeting bumblebees, so we went places we expected to see them, and we mostly paid attention to them, but we saw lots of other bees. It's worth noting there's a lot of honeybees. As much trouble as honeybees face, they're the numerically most dominant species by far that we ran into, even though we were trying to find bumblebees. That's good news for honeybees. It's perhaps means there's somebody else eating their food, but that's not an issue I'm going to try to address right here. This is a breakdown by species, and I apologize that these are only common, the scientific names, but you might be kind of used to some of them by now. Just as I predicted, the common eastern bumblebee was the most common. It made up nearly over 2/3 of our sightings. That was not the case 30 years ago. The evidence that shows up in historical collections it was more towards half. It seems to be benefiting. My impression is it likes cities, it likes people, and it seems to be one of those species that is going to thrive as humans cause changes. Perhaps it's filling in for the rusty patch and other bees that we're not finding, but no one's quite sure. If those top 3 species I talked to you, the brown-belted and the two-spot, make up, together with the eastern bumblebee, 95% of all the bees we saw. So we have a pretty lopsided bumblebee community, more so than what appears to have been the case in historic times. But we've got some we do have representation from a number of what I'm going to call rare species. Unfortunately, not a single Bombus affinis. We've looked everywhere. We've gone. If there was a call or a lure I could use, I would have used it. We can't find this thing. We went places that I used to see it. We went places that other people have seen it. We went places that have all the right food and everything that we know of at once. Not seeing them. If we had done this in 1990, I would guess that about 150 of the bees we saw would have been Bombus affinis at the least. So the short answer, you can turn off your monitors now because we didn't find it. If that's all you were here for, I've got an answer for you. But we learned a lot of other things that we're going to try to go with. And this doesn't mean it's not here. It means it's less than 1 in 10,000 bees, which is pretty bad news. I'm hopeful that somewhere there's a little lingering population of them. We didn't get to every corner of the state. We didn't get to every corner of the state at all times of year, so there's no telling what might still be out there, but it's not common. It's not what it used to be. The story that we have to tell Department of Transportation is that it's unlikely you're going to run into this bee if you're just poking around. But I'm still looking for it, and if you see something that looks like it, I want to know about it. We'll talk more about that in a minute. There's a lot of information we can pull out of this that we think will be helpful in planning. For example, what about those rare species? Are there certain types of habitats that they're likely to be found in? And the answer is yeah. These natural fields and planted things like planted prairies and even sort of shrubby areas, they seem to be sustaining much larger numbers of these rare species. You see more of them than on roadsides. Now that's sort of bad news because I want to find that roadsides are good too. But at least either roadsides in general or the way that roadsides are set up now doesn't seem, maybe we haven't quantified yet, all these data are brand new, we haven't quantified yet whether they're good for bees in general. I'm sure that they're at least okay for them. But what we're seeing that they don't seem to be especially good at bringing in those rare species that might become problems in the future. And so that's an area for more study. What can we do that'll help these bees that don't seem to be doing quite as well? You will not be surprised to see the plants that we most commonly found bees on, the top ones. Anybody who's been out in a prairie or other restoration knows that bee balm is properly named. The bees love it. Now, and red clover turns out to be, it's not a native, but it gets a lot of bees and a lot of bee species. Now, all of these turn out to be among our most common plants that in areas we surveyed. So this doesn't tell you which ones, if you can only plant one plant, which one to do, but this has to do with how abundant those plants were as well. But when you see a spot that has any of these plants growing in there, that's a spot that's going to be helping bumblebees. We're madly analyzing the data now, and I don't have a lot of answers other than what the preliminary stuff I've shown you. One thing we're looking at is whether these are all circles of about a mile surrounding a particular spot. So if I'm in the center of the circle, what's within a mile or a mile and a half of where I am? And in some habitats, that's all agriculture. In some areas, that's the brown. And then the red and pink here represents industrial and urban stuff. And then there's sort of woods and forest and pasture using the yellows and greens. These bees can fly several miles to forage. And so what matters to the bees, the bumblebees in particular, for their survival is a lot to do with the type of habitat that's nearby. And we think that if we go to survey a spot here that's got an acre of flowers, there might be perhaps more or fewer bees than in an area that's in the center of this circle where it's mostly buildings. That's a question we don't yet have an answer to. And so you'll have to ask me to come back later to see what kinds of answers we come out. But that's the kind of a question we're interested in answering from this really remarkable data set. There's not many people who have looked at as many bees in as many spots as we have, and we want to try to learn as much as we can from it as possible. The citizen science of this has two main threads. One of them is to use eyeballs across the state. And so a lot of folks are using a social media for biology nerds site called iNaturalist. And what it basically is a site that you can go up there, upload a photo you've taken of a bee. It's like this one on the left here. You upload that photo. You either provide or, well, you could provide in one way or another the GPS coordinates of where it was found. And then even if you don't know what it is, someone else will identify it for you, because there's a bunch of people. It's crazy. As soon as things go up on there, these nuts who love to identify bumblebees for fun, like me, will look at the pictures and then try to identify what they are. And if there's enough information in the picture, and it doesn't take that much, we can tell you what you got. And we started this up in 2 years ago in the spring, and in the course of almost 2 years now, we've got over almost 7,000 bee observations. Look at all these gray dots. Those are places where someone has reported a bee. And we've found 111 species of bee. Obviously, there's more than just bumblebees getting reported here. But if you look over on the right, the most common species, the common eastern bumblebee, the honeybee, carpenter bees, and then the brown-belted and the two-spotted. So these amateur naturalists are giving information that's confirming the patterns that we're finding in our field surveys, but they're bringing us out. We're getting observations out in the corners of the state that we haven't been able to go to, and into specific locations that we haven't been able to go to. And this has been remarkably helpful. It's brought in a lot of people and got their imaginations about it and gets them thinking about bees, which is really good. And so you are all welcome to do that. It's very, very simple. I'm not going to try to explain it in this format, but it's very simple. Just upload some photos, and pretty quick we'll get over 10,000 bees, I'm hopeful. A second component of our citizen science work is we think that a really important part of the biology, as I explained earlier, is this nest establishment period. And they're really hard to find, the bees, then, because there's only the queen and not the dozens or hundreds of workers that each nest will send out. And so you don't see nearly the number of individuals, and so it takes a lot of searching to get just a few observations. So what we've, working again with Denise and with others, what we've set up is a protocol where you can record, as you go on your hike, every time you see a queen bumblebee, you record it, and then you report that, and we can use those pieces of information to try to understand what kind of habitats are bees using for searching for nests. And we have some preliminary input in that different species seem to look for different habitats to nest in. And that might suggest to us places to start looking for them. So we're still early in this. We have about 400 sightings in for that, and we're going to be continuing in the spring. And so if you're interested, go work with Denise. She's the one who's really helped us make this something more than just us looking for friends, but bringing all you really dedicated naturalists that have been associated with this project, with her get the project. I ought to say a few words at least about why are these bees going down. This is a situation where it's like an Agatha Christie novel in that we've got a lot of suspects, and we don't have the last chapter yet, so we don't know which ones are involved. I will tell you the answer, and I think the Murder on the Orient Express was like this. It's not just one of the suspects. The problems are many, and we suspect that the bees could survive any one of the challenges that are listed here on their own. But when you're getting hit with both pesticides and habitat destruction and a changing climate, for example, in the same way that if I get a cold, I'll get along. If I lose my job, I can get along. But if I have both of those happen at once, I'm in double trouble. And it might give you that straw that breaks the camel's back. And it appears that although each one of these is probably having some effect on why some species of bees are declining, it's the combination that's causing the real problems here. It's not clear whether the same thing that's causing problems for the rusty-patched bee is also causing problems for Bombus fervidus, or is often also causing problems for honeybees. There's some overlap, undoubtedly. What I'll do is outline a couple of these, just to give you a hint, and partly because I think it's useful that we all have some idea of what can we individually do to help out a little bit. Habitat is a really important part of this thing. In the lower right, there's a aerial imagery comparing the 1948 Cleveland area, with the red being buildings and asphalt and things like that, and the green being parks and green open space, and the white being somewhere in between. And then 2002. There's not as much, there's an awful lot of asphalt and buildings going on there. And if you're a bee, that's not necessarily going to be the best habitat. And so it also tends to isolate, if the bee, to the extent the bees need natural areas, it isolates those areas. And it means the populations are going to be smaller, and that's, for obvious reasons, a problem. And so where agriculture fits into this is a good question. There's evidence that some types of agriculture under some circumstances are beneficial to bees, but a lot of the time when it's all, as far as the eye can see, it's corn, there's no food for bees. When you have any number of blueberries and strawberries and things like that are good food for bees, it can be quite the opposite, where farming can be positive. But many times the flowering period for them is really limited, and these bees need food throughout the year, and so that causes a different kind of problem. So it might be good for some of these solitary bees that we haven't talked about, that only fly for a few weeks, but it might be difficult for bumblebees. Even though it's good at one time of year, it's not good throughout the year. So the agricultural input there is part, but in these city areas, perhaps planting some more flowers on our own would be a good thing to do. I know that's what I try to do. And my grad student page is trying to look at, are there urban habitats that foster more bumblebees than others? And we don't know the answer yet. She's analyzing the data. A really obvious candidate here is pesticides. We're spraying a lot of chemicals around there, way less than would be the case if people weren't really smart about them. We've gone from having pesticides that killed everything, people, birds, insects, to pesticides that kill only a limited number of types of animal. Often it's just insects, but bees are insects. And so although we're getting better at using fewer and fewer of these chemicals, they are definitely causing problems. And this is a problem that is shared both by agricultural applicators. They have large areas and necessarily use a lot of these chemicals, but it's also people like you and me in our backyards using, if a little is good, more is better is not the rule here. You would need to be really targeted when you use it and only use what's necessary. I just try to minimize their use. I don't have a problem with people using these things. They just got to be careful and not spread them everywhere all the time. And there's really good guidance here, and many people can tell you this. Just follow the instructions, and then don't use any more than you need. And when you're choosing your foods, if you choose stuff from suppliers who use fewer than chemicals, then you're probably helping out a little too. Again, I don't think pesticides is the only problem here. But it's a possible one, and we know that's a problem in some cases. We all have to try to do what we can to minimize each of those possible causes of decline if we're going to make any progress. So what I try to do is I try to do, in my little part of the world, I've got a little backyard, and so I try to have a lot of flowers. I try to have a lot of places that they can nest. This is something that a lot of people forget. It's easy to say bees need flowers. Bees also need to nest. And so you see down here, here's some bees nesting near the foundation of a house. A little crevice here that leads to probably what was an old mouse nest. Over in the lower right, this is a tussock of grass where there was a bee nest. Now, it turns out a badger dug this one up. So there are some problems they face. But having some unmanaged areas of your yard can provide a spot for those old mouse nests, for clumps of grass, for compost heaps, where these bees can find a little cavity and nest up. There are a number of innovative ideas of how you can make a little bee domicile to encourage them to nest. This is just an overturned pot. There's a little tube that goes through there, so it's protected, so the bees can crawl through the tube and in. Give it a try. My experience is that for every 10 of those I put out, I get one that's colonized, so it's not a really high return on investment, but people are working all the time on better designs on how you can help out bumblebees. But when you're planting your plants, try to have flowers throughout the year. Don't if you have a great show in August but you don't have anything in May, there won't be anyone to enjoy it, because that bee nest needs to get established. And you try to reduce your personal pesticide use as much as possible. And when you use it, you don't spray it on the flowers. Where you don't use systemics, where the neonicotinoids can get incorporated into the nectar and pollen the bees pick up, even though you don't spray it while they're flowering. So you want to pay attention to those kinds of things. And it's useful to remember that these are big bees, and they'll fly a mile with no problem. And so you don't have to provide everything that the bees in your neighborhood need yourself, because the bees, if you have a bee nest in your backyard, they're pulling in food from within a mile or more. And so what I do is, when I take a walk in my neighborhood, I look to see what's available. And if I see, you know, nobody in my neighborhood has anything that's flowering in between April and May, I try to plant things like that. And so I try to make for a complete diet, for a complete set of requirements that these bees need. So this is a beautiful photo from the OSU insect collection. One of the specimens of the Rusty-Patched Bumble Bee that they have, they're collected in 1985. They've got collections from long before then, not very many after that. It gives me pause, because I see that the person who confirmed that this is the Rusty-Patched Bumble Bee was Liz Day, who I happen to have known. She died a few years ago. She was a tragic car accident. She was one of these unsung heroes who goes out and tries to figure out the bees. She's one of the people who raised the alarm, and she's gone now. And it looks like the bees may be too. And that gives me a lot of sadness. And thinking about her and thinking about the situation with these bees is something to be sober about. But it's not over yet. In some areas of the country, this is a photo from up in Wisconsin, they're still out there. And if we can figure out what's going on with them, and if we can protect the habitats that they need now, so that if we can figure out the problem and solve that, then they have places to go back to. Maybe we're going to leave the place a little better than it was when we got here. So that's sort of the main talk I want to give here. I want to just quickly point you to you can go and visit us and help with the survey in the Citizen Science Angles. There's a lot of organizations that are working on this. I'm going to flash through these. I'm sure that they're available on the PDF afterwards. And if you want to learn more, we live in a world of remarkable wealth as far as information goes. There's so much you can learn about bumblebees and all of nature with the amazing materials that are available both online and in other forums. And I hope you will take the opportunity to use those. So that's all I have to say. I'll turn it over to Denise.